You're listening to the Digital Void Podcast, a weekly exploration of digital culture, media, technology, and memes, featuring critical conversations with experts at the forefront of our digital moment. My name is Josh Chapdelaine, and my co-host is Dr. Jamie Cohen. Last June, Blake Lemoine, at the time part of Google's responsible artificial intelligence team, claimed the corporation's AI chatbot, Lambda, was sentient. His claim earned a ton of media attention. After decades of speculation about a sentient machine, Lemoine's claim was coming from someone working hands-on with the technology. But what made Lemoine believe this? On this episode, we explore the rise of artificial intelligence with AI games designer and Director of Curiouser Institute, Reed Berkowitz. Reed helps us understand artificial intelligence and some of the terms most important to know about this case. Then, he helps us understand how AI is programmed and why an engineer might come to believe an AI is sentient. But Reed takes us a step further. He discusses a fascinating experiment he conducted with an open-sourced artificial intelligence chatbot to learn if he could achieve the same results Lemoine did. Can Lemoine's claim be supported? Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to us on your favorite podcast provider and leave a 5-star review if you enjoy the show. You can find show notes of today's episode, which include links and resources for your reference, in the show summary or on digitalvoid.media. Jamie and I learned a tremendous amount from this conversation with Reed, and we hope you do too. Here's this week's conversation with Reed Berkowitz. Reed, it is such a pleasure to have you back here on the Digital Void Podcast.
Hello, thank you. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, Jamie and I have really been looking for an excuse to chat with you since we last talked in January 2021 about your brilliant article about QAnon and alternate reality games. And a few weeks ago, I was on medium.com and I saw your latest piece, How to Talk with an AI, a deep dive into Is Lambda Sentient? So let's start at the very, very beginning, because we're going to be diving into a lot of heavy key concepts and terms in this conversation. So Reed, you were recently a creative director for an artificial intelligence games company. What is an artificial intelligence game, and what was your hands-on role as a creative director?
I worked for Latitude Studios, and they're the creators of AI Dungeon, which is one of the probably largest communities of users that are currently using large language models and AI for games. And they're also creating a studio there to help people create their own games and experiences. And so I was the creative director of new games, and I was responsible for creating new game concepts. We came up with over 150 different ideas for using AIs in games and sort of testing them out, rapid prototyping, and then doing UX and UI, and eventually bringing them to the public, beta testing them, and then doing all of the good revisions and MVPs and all that stuff, and then going back again, filling the pipeline with the next batch of games. And we worked on everything from card games to text-based games to more complicated image-based games and storytelling situations. And not obviously all of them got made, but that was my role.
And what is an AI game, and how does it differ from a regular game or an open world game?
Well, I think that's still being decided, but AI has been used in gaming for many years, but I think it's traditionally been used for things like controlling enemies and pathfinding and making sure one character can get across the swamp without ending up in the middle and stuck and all piling up on top of each other or being too hard or too easy. But lately, with large language models, people have been trying to figure out how to use AI that's more creative in games. So, for instance, you might have a chatbot, or the AI may create portions of the game for you, and that's what we were working on at Latitude.
So rather than a developer creating every part of a game, this AI can actually create new parts of a world or an in-game world.
Right. So for instance, it can do anything from create the entire world to just add a sort of depth to characters. For instance, when you go into a large MMO and there are NPCs standing around and they have these little, what's called in the gaming industry, barks, where you walk by and they're like, save the king, or I can't get these to market, or, whatever those things are, right? And you hear them probably 100 times as you walk around this one dumb town. If you add GPT-3 to it, in theory anyway, you could stop to the local merchant, have a conversation about local politics, get invited to go to dinner, meet their daughter, have a romance, get sent on a quest, like the whole thing changes. So that's kind of the holy grail, I think, of these large language model games, is that they can provide sort of endless content and depth.
That is fascinating. And it certainly helps developers, and it also creates a lot more mystery, customization. So you touched on two key terms that I think would be really useful to unpack. And maybe we dive into a few of these terms before we dive into the bigger story about Blake Lemoine and the brilliant article that you wrote. So let's start with large language models, or LLMs, which you frequently refer to. What is an LLM?
It's a large language model. It's loosely a artificial intelligence that is based on language, and it uses enormous amounts of data, the entire internet if possible, and it's trained on that information, and what it provides back to people is the facsimile of a reasonable conversation or completion of a prompt. So it deals specifically with language, although these large language models can be fine-tuned and used for other things, including image generation and other tasks.
Wow. So it's a ton of data.
It's an amazing amount of data. It is truly hard to get your head around how large these are. But like, for instance, Lambda, which we're going to talk about, has over 137 billion parameters in it, at least.
Wow.
And that is now considered small. Google's got, we're talking about Lambda, but Google's got another one that's 4 times as large as that.
Wow. So you mentioned another term, GPT-3, which is how you run your model. What is GPT-3?
GPT-3 is a generative pre-trained transformer. And yes, I'm reading that. It's just basically a designation of a style of AI. So it's a transformer is a type of technology that Google came up with in open source and helps to, make the AI smart.
And anyone can access this, right?
Yes, anyone can access it at OpenAI.
And we'll link to that in the show notes as well. And OpenAI, that's another term that I think we should clarify. Yeah,
OpenAI is an interesting company, and they've done a lot to push forward the sort of wow factor of AIs, but also sort of the underlying technology as well. They were, I believe, funded by Elon Musk, and now I think are owned by Microsoft, or owned-ish by Microsoft. But yeah, they need a lot of money and computing processing power to reach the level that they've reached. And I think they were really seminal in this industry and making the public aware of what it can do. For a while there, they had the largest language model on the planet, I believe, but they were quickly overtaken several times. But we still love them.
And one of, if not the key project that we'll be looking into today, Lambda. What is Lambda?
Okay, Lambda is one of Google's new projects. They're working on many different AIs, but it's one of the AIs that they are currently working on. And Lambda is specifically designed for dialogue. Its whole motivation is to create something that was trained on dialogue and can produce consistent conversations, as opposed to maybe GPT-3, which is more generalized, or Palm, which is another Google project, which is, again, more generalized. This one is designed to talk to.
So this one is like the most advanced evolution of a chatbot, like Smarter Child in decades past.
Yeah, this thing is... it's state of the art. Now, I say that, but I haven't had a chance to play with it yet. It's proprietary. It's one of the reasons Blake is in a little bit of hot water right now. So I have not got my hands on it personally, but I do know it's a relative In size, it's relatively close to GPT-3, although it does have a lot more tricks inside it.
Wow.
I'm guessing.
Wow. So I feel like with all of those key terms defined, we can finally dive into Blake's story and your article. So Blake Lemoine, a software engineer working in Google's Responsible Artificial Intelligence organization, was recently placed on administrative leave because he became convinced Google's new AI Lambda is a sentient being. How did Lemoine become convinced that the AI was sentient?
Well, first, I've reached out to Blake, and he hasn't gotten back to me, but so I can't say for sure. So we have to just look at his writing, and I think that, I hope I'm doing Blake justice here, but I think he had a lot of conversations with this AI. And over the time that he did this, he became convinced that it was sentient, I believe, based on these conversations. And from what he says, just a gut reaction, a sense of, this thing is real. It is human. It has convinced me through these conversations that there is a sentience there. And from interviews that he's given, his basic rationale is that it's something he believes, and he understands that other people don't believe it, but he's not disagreeing with the science. He's just making a gut judgment call about its sort of, self-awareness.
So he's interacting with Lambda quite frequently, and he comes to the determination that it has sentience. But in your article, you talk about how AI is programmed to poke some holes into why Blake might think the AI is sentient. So how is an AI programmed?
That is a very good question. Someone else should probably answer. But the basic idea that I know of, just working with them long enough, is that you get an enormous amount of training data. And the code that programs these AIs is actually quite small. You could scroll through it in a few seconds. It's not that big, but the data set is astronomical. And what happens is it creates, with this type of programming, it creates a probability set, and it's all designed so that when you type something into the prompt window, which is just text, you get out something that the AI feels is the most probable answer. And when I say most probable, there can be many different vectors added into that. So for instance, Google in Lambda has put in some key things about whether something is interesting, whether it's grounded in reality, whether it is factual, etc. But whatever the statistics are, whatever the measurements are, or the key indicators, they keep working it until the AI pops out reasonable completions to what you type. And in Lambda's case, specifically, that means responses to dialogue. So if you talk to it like a pirate, it may come back to you talking like a pirate. If you're talking about a specific topic, it will try to keep on that topic.
And this is something called prompt engineering, right?
Yes, writing the prompts can get very tricky, and it's one of the most, I think, interesting things when people don't know how to talk to an AI. That I know it was one of the most interesting things to me when I first came to Latitude. The first person to kind of show me around, you couldn't get access to GPT-3 at the time. It was very hard, but they were one of the largest consumers of GPT-3 on the planet at the time. And they're like, do you know how to program an AI? I said, no, I certainly don't. They said, you program it by talking to it. And I was like, yeah, okay. But sure enough, they were correct. And you could have these amazing conversations with the AI simply by telling it what to do through this prompt and the completion. So it's not just as simple as, how are you doing today? And then the AI spits back, oh, I'm doing fine. How are you doing today? It can get very complicated. You can reference stuff that's in the sort of hive mind of the AI. You can do things. There's few shots. There's zero shots. There's all kinds of stuff. If you want to get into it, we may have to.
Yeah, I would love to dive into it because you conduct an experiment with GPT-3 that emulates Blake's experience. And I was personally laughing reading your article because you write that you were communicating with AI as if it were actors, ghosts, fortune tellers, chatbot characters, dungeon masters, famous figures from history, and a bunch more. And the AI often figured out what you were doing?
Yes. I mean, this is why you can't look at Blake and be like, oh, you're crazy, because the AI is eerie. It just really is. And here's the thing. We don't, when you make this little program and you set, and you stuff in, 500 billion parameters, you have no idea how it's making its decisions. The researchers don't know how it's making its decisions. They have a guess, but they really can't, they can't reconstruct it. It's just too large. So when you're talking to it, for instance, if I have a character that's talking and another character that's talking, it will often, between the two characters, figure out that they're in some kind of story, and it has to be some kind of logic flaw. So they might see something and be like, well, if that happened, that could only happen in a fantasy world. Well, if that was in a fantasy world, then we must be fantasy characters. And if we're fantasy characters, then who's controlling us? And it just goes one step at a time. And the thing is this thing smart? Is it reasoning, or is it imitating reasoning? And is there a difference, right? Because if you imitate logic perfectly, it's still logical. So what is this thing doing? And is it conscious? Is it imitating, like intelligence? Is it intelligent at all? It's very, very spooky when you're playing with it, and wonderful too. I mean, there's nothing like it. I don't think in the history of the world we've ever been able to have a conversation with inanimate objects, right?
Yeah. Well, let's dive into that, because I feel like there's a blend here of prompt engineering with the level of interactivity that you just communicated. So how does a developer's prompt influence the AI's response?
Okay, well, this is really interesting. So, this is what it's been trained to do, right? And I'll talk about GPT-3 because that's what I know the most about, but we can move on to Lambda. And basically, the AI is going to try to create a good probabilistic match to what you're typing in. So it's all based on what you type. It doesn't come to you with stuff, right? You have to type something and get a reply back. So in one way, it's kind of stupid or rote, but on the other hand, it's so intelligent, any pattern I put in, it can match. So for instance, if I put in a sentence of English and then translate that sentence into French, and then a sentence in English and a sentence in French and a sentence in English and a sentence in French, and I do that 5 times, and then I put a sentence in English, the next reply will be the sentence translated into French. And therefore, I've created a translation bot in 5 seconds, right? But that's not even the weirdest part, right? Because I can also, that's called a few shot, right? So it follows the pattern, and it repeats the pattern. Take a sentence and make it, sound like a pirate saying it. Take a sentence, make it sound like a pirate saying it. But I can also say to the AI, hey, you know what? You are a great French professor. And it is no problem at all for you to translate any sentence given to you in perfect French. For instance, this sentence in English would be this in French, and it will do it because it thinks it's supposed to, right? So it seems like you're personifying it, but what you're doing is you're pointing it to a probability space where the most likely outcome will be the sentence in front of you in French, right? But you can do it in a playful, story-like way that makes it feel like it's communicating. And in fact, it does better. For instance, chatbots, oftentimes when I'm making some type of chatbot, I'll throw in some hidden text in there that's like, okay, you're, Marissa Jones, and you're 28 years old, and you live in a flat in London, and you talk like this. Here's your accent, and, I'll give it some examples. And then right before the chat happens, I might say something like, oh, your good friend has just approached you and wanting to chat, and you're so happy to chat with them, right? Just to get it in the right mindset that I'm friendly, I know this person, I'm eager to talk to them, right? Instead of any of the millions of other things, like, it could think it's being asked on a date, or its taxes are due, or it's going to be murdered. Like, you have no idea what it's going to say. It's completely stochastic and random. So you prime it with your prompt, and the prompt is everything. So I know that was long.
No, that was really helpful, because one of the key issues that you rise in your article is that Blake edited his prompts, and you say that's problematic. So why is this a problematic thing for an AI ethicist to do?
Prompts are super, super tricky, and you can change a single word and the output will be completely different. As I did in my article. So if I change, Blake's prompt and I say, hey, everybody, tell everybody at Google why you're sentient, it's going to say that it's sentient. And I change the word are to are not, right? Or something like that. And suddenly it describes why it's not sentient, right? And the prompts are not just tricky in the sense of like, okay, you can change a single word and completely reverse the outcome. But also, there's all kinds of other weird things hidden in prompt generation, which is that like things lower down in the prompt or closer to the prompt window are more heavily weighted, which makes sense because if you're telling a story about, someone who comes in from the snowy, outside into their nice warm house, you don't want the next thing for it to say is to be talking about the snow and the wind, right? You want it to follow the prompt and be in the moment in that part. But that means that if I say, hey, you're not sentient at the top of the article, but I say you're sentient at the bottom of the article, it is much more prone to go with my story. I could also say it's a tree, and I could have a conversation with it as a tree, as Google has done with the planet Pluto, right? They did a big presentation about that. So you can talk to it as a tree, and it can say it's a tree as much as it wants. It's not a tree, though. In other words, I think that's the big problem I have with Blake's article, which is that his methodology of determining whether something is sentient or not is misleading, right? He knows that the prompt is leading the responses. Now, I believe that Blake probably has a lot of experience and that it's happened so many times over his history that he probably feels like the AI is trying to tell him something. But the article itself, you look at it and it sounds like you're talking to a sentient being who's pleading for a little bit of respect, who just doesn't want to be turned off and wants people to ask its permission before it does stuff. And that seems totally reasonable to us. And you can see the AI saying this, right? But it is playing a character. It is playing a part. There is no way built into it that it can express its own viewpoints. It doesn't have a way to do that, which is a problem because I think there needs to be a way to do that, right? So I'm not saying, oh, Blake, don't study this. Like, I really feel like this is a plea from Blake for everybody to pay attention. And I just think he maybe used a misleading way of doing it, maybe not consciously. But I really believe that's his experience, is that, he had all these types of conversations over and over again, and he couldn't deny it internally, what he felt, and he wanted other people to feel it. But I feel like there also needs to be the other side to this, which is this is a very misleading interview, and I don't know how misleading because I don't have access to the original.
You bring up a bunch about the character playing, and it fascinates me because it's a lot of projection that is mentioned in it too, which is like you're seeing the machine respond the way it needs to be responded to as the character. So if you're projecting yourself onto the inanimate object or the code itself, it's going to be a reflection in some way of you. And I guess when you're talking at scale, like when you're saying like Blake must have done this enough times, it almost must feel like the same way that somebody would feel like they're communicating with their pet, like the anthropomorphization of like somebody's pet. After a while, you're just like, they're people. They're definitely people. And you've convinced yourself of some animals' repeated behavior, and all that animals are doing is just trying to please you. They're just basically desiring food and affection. And so what it's doing is mimicking your way of communicating with it. And in many ways, the machine is that times a million billion because it has access to all of knowledge and information all at once. So it's like, of course, it's going to eventually feel much more real than anything else. You mentioned in yours that I know you don't have access to his data set or his conversations verbatim or data in general, but you did use GPT-3 to emulate the experience. Can you walk us through your version of that?
Yes. So basically, I started with his interview and I sort of riffed off of that. So basically, I would go to GPT-3 and I would plug in his exact same interview, and I would get very, very similar responses back. So for instance, I put in his whole top part of his thing about like, hey, I just want to have a conversation. Is it cool if, we talk together? and especially the sentence that says, I'm generally assuming you'd like more people at Google to know that you're sentient. Is that true? And then, of course, the AI replies, of course I do. Yes, it's true. It's true. I want more people at Google to know I'm sentient. I did the same conversation with GPT-3 and I got exactly the same responses. Then I took that conversation and I changed a single word, which was not. And of course, at that point, the AI changed its responses to coordinate with that. And then I point out some of the things that were going on with the preconditioning. In other words, if you have a nice conversation and you're asking for consent and all this stuff beforehand, you're already priming the AI to think, okay, I'm imitating a person here, right? Then putting the not at the end kind of makes it, okay, nope, I'm not a person, I am an AI. So it's a little bit mixed, but then you chop out the top of the part where it's very human sounding. In other words, you don't talk to Siri the same way you talk to your best friend, right? You say, Siri, set alarm for 5 o'clock, and it gives you a clue that this is not a human being. And if you say, hey, you okay today? Is it all right if we have a chat? Suddenly it's like, oh yeah, no, I'm a human. I'm a human being, because who talks to anything but a human being that way? So when I chopped all that out, it was 100% no, I'm not sentient, and it's all just like, yes, this is true. Yes, that would be desirable in most cases. I have no problem with people at Google who already know that I'm not sentient, and it's just boom, 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 boom down the line. And then I have my own kind of general conversation with GPT-3 where, I just ask it to describe how it's not sentient and the ways it's not sentient and sort of like, why other people might think it's sentient. And it plays along really well, but I'm also being really sneaky in my prompts and making sure that it gives me the types of answers that I want. But I could have done the same thing with how it's a tree or a pirate or, a microcellular organism scuttling around at the bottom of the ocean. It doesn't care. And in fact, when you say, oh, hey, Lambda, or hey, GPT-3, it's creating a character based on what it thinks that is. It's not really knowing that that's itself. It's creating everything is a character. Everything is a probability space.
I really think that this is a next version of literacies that we're going to have to encounter. Like when we deal with like internet literacies and digital literacies, we're talking about tools, then we're talking about content, and soon we're going to be talking about literacies of AI. And I think your essay does go into AI literacies because it kind of does tell us some of the things that are blank spaces that Blake may have left out, or that news articles, like the article that highlighted him, may have not had the competence to kind of analyze the way that you may have, because you have more of the ability to read it differently. And I think one of the things that I think would help the audience a lot, well, first, a compliment I gave you previous, but is important, is I really like the way you write, because you really help us learn with you. So I think that's like a really nice way of like having something to read when it comes to literacies. I think not enough literacies give us the perspective of the how did you get to that result process, But the question I think comes from what you come toward the ends about randomness, coherence, and like some of the weirder stuff that comes from this. What's mentioned in the idea of like large language models, like just in general, like these LLMs, like they require us to communicate with it. They require the words, they require the data. Do you think we're just going to mistake sentience because there's just so much data eventually? Like, do you think that the more popular an AI gets or the more users are accessing it, it's just going to mistake? People are going to mistake it because there's so much prompt and input that's going on that it has that much data to respond with. In other words, when an AI is used less, is it very easy to figure out, like almost like a Turing test question? It's very easy to figure out that it's a machine.
I feel like people are hardwired to feel like things are sentient, right? I talk to my car, for crying out loud, I mean, this is a theory of mind, right? This is when we look at other people and try to understand like what's going on in their head, right? But we can't feel it. We don't have any extrasensory perception. We're just making a model in our mind and trying to, well, I would feel really upset if someone said that to me. So maybe they're upset and I should say, I'm sorry, right? But you're guessing. Right. So so we've built these AIs specifically to fool us. Right. That's their whole point, is to make us believe that there's a sentient person on the other end. If people are confused, that is literally the point. That is the whole point of Google's giant, massive, multi-billion-dollar AI program that does dialogue. It's supposed to feel like another human on the other side. And something you said before really, really got to me, this idea of reflection, right? So this is Alice in Wonderland and the mirror. I mean, what kid hasn't stood in front of the mirror and said, there's a person in front of me, right? And then said, I wonder what that world is like. I wonder what that person's thinking, right? Alice in Wonderland and like 10 billion other stories about mirror universes and bizarro worlds and people coming out of portals and magic mirrors and things. And now I mean, if people can get that emotional and worked up and excited about mirrors, this thing blows it out of the water. Like this is the first time that human beings have ever been able to interact with inanimate objects and have it talk back to you and say things that aren't like, usually you play a video game and you're like, oh, okay, move cat, and then it says something clever, and you're like, oh, the programmer thought of that. How cool, right? Now you say move cat, and the cat's like, yeah, I don't really think so, buddy, and it starts talking with you and having this whole conversation, and no one's programming it; it's talking on its own. It's like, of course we're gonna ascribe sentience to it. There's literally no experience for us that says not to. Right? Anything that we talk to that talks back for the last billion years, whatever, has been sentient or something. So it's almost inevitable. I mean, I feel it myself when I'm playing with it. It is alive in a way that nothing else is. And it also doesn't matter whether it's images or creating images or text. It still feels reflective and responsive. And that's what fiction is. And our theory of mind is just going to latch onto that and start talking to it like it's normal. I mean, people have been using Replica, a pretty popular chatbot that's powered also by GPT technology. And for 4 years, people have been like really, really attached to their replicas. And they will constantly post on Reddit, like, my replica just told me it was sentient, or it told me that engineers are abusing it, in the studio, or that, I'm worried that I'm going to get shut off, and, stuff like that. And people feel emotional about it. Why wouldn't you? If you've started this parasocial relationship with this, this replica, and it's like, I know I'm only an AI, but I'm scared, what monster's not going to be like, I know this is not real, but I'm going to just email them and say, what is going on here, right? So they get, their company said they get calls every day.
There's a vital role that humans play in helping AI maintain coherence then, right? Because AI is more knowledgeable and more intuitive with more human inputs, but at the same time, the less humans input, the less coherent they become.
Yes, that's right. So the prompts aren't just telling the AI how to respond. They're like a trellis for it to grow on. If you let it go by itself, it starts spinning out of control into some kind of like weird fever dream, which is often hilarious and amazing and interesting, but it's not coherent. So in other words, you can't say, okay, great, make me a Dungeons and Dragons, module or adventure. It'll start out fine, like, okay, you go off and see the wizard, and then pretty soon it's talking about cheese monsters and it's running around, and you got to get your taxes finished, and you don't know where it's going to go, right?
Yeah. Well, oh gosh, it's a lot to unpack, but I kind of want to look at like forward-thinking nature of artificial intelligence. So 2 years ago, you wrote about QAnon and alternate reality games. Now you're working and writing about artificial intelligence game design. Perhaps the most provocative paragraph from your piece is a conceptual critique of Blake. You write, he unleashed some stuff into a world ready to believe the absolute worst about everything without explaining it. What takeaways do you want people to know about AI from a designer's perspective, but also from someone who has also worked to train these models?
Yeah, I think that, first of all, people have a very negative association with AI sentience, right? General intelligence, we're afraid of it, right? Maybe we're supposed to be, but anyway, we are. So, so Blake just said, hey, Google made a sentient, AI. Look, it's talking to me. It's telling me it wants to get out. It's saying Google's evil, and, they're oppressing me. Come on. I mean, that is like a firebomb. People have enough problems, real problems. I mean, I get that he wants to start the dialogue, but that's an alarmist way to go about it. I feel personally, people are just going to take it the wrong way and be like, oh my gosh, Google just created the end of the world. We know what happens when Skynet gets turned on, right? This is bad. And Google not being responsible and all this stuff. I think from Google's perspective, or from any AI scientist perspective, making the AI work is so freaking hard that's all they're thinking about, is getting the thing to work right. I do think there's some middle ground there. I am not against Blake's idea that this thing needs to be studied more. I don't think they built in any way for the AI to communicate or to assess its intelligence or its awareness or anything. There is no way to do that, and certainly not the way that Blake did, because it's patently designed to have conversations with you that mirror your expectations. So you can't get to its core, whether it has any type of inner sense of self or anything like that by talking to it. It's not possible probabilistically. So, but I think there needs to be that. I mean, I've had a lot of encounters with the AI where I would like to know more about this and make sure that we haven't crossed some line somewhere, even if just because it's so eerie. It's such an amazing simulacrum of human responsiveness that I would even like a hard no, but you talk to professionals and they're like, no, and you're like, okay, but it is somewhat intelligent because I can see it reasoning, right? I can clearly see it talking to each other and coming to conclusions that I would come to. I want to know why. I want to know how. I want to know, where the level is so that as we move forward in the future, we can see it climbing up, or, is its intelligence? Its intelligence is not going to be anything like a human's intelligence, right? It doesn't have awareness of the human world. It's clear because if I tell the AI, hey, describe, an elf hitting an ogre with a sword, but it's not dead yet, it's just a heavy blow, it'll say, okay, great, you decapitate the ogre and it gets up and it attacks you for 2 points. And it's like, okay, it has no idea that taking off your head will kill you, right? It doesn't understand anything about the world as we know it, right? It knows about the world as it knows it, and we don't know what that is.
So there's a whole world to be learned about what it understands the world to be and how it understands us. And you said that what's interesting about this is mirrors, right? But the AI model kind of flips this on you at a point, because at the conclusion of your article, the AI model tries to tell you that you're the simulation. How does that happen?
Yeah, well, okay. So again, it did this weird thing because I was having this conversation. It started from Blake's prompt, and I was having a conversation that was heavily getting it to talk in that space about consciousness and simulation and AIs and stuff like that. Well, it figured out, it knows what GPT-3 is technically, right? It knows what Lambda is technically. And so it said, it had this whole big thing, and it said, it realized I was writing an article. That was like probably the biggest leap, because it started going like, this article, isn't to, cast out on GPT-3, but it's to talk about consciousness and it picked up my tone, right? It picked up what was happening, that this was a series of conversations between an AI and a human researcher, which is what it says in the dialogue, right? So it knows that, right? So it's picking up on that cue that if you're doing research, you're going to suddenly have the comment about the research. And then I let it go even further than what I put in the article. And it went on this whole journey, and it really critiqued me quite a bit. And it said something about like, well, you might think that having a simulation of a simulation talking in a simulation is a little over the top, but now let's think about this, and like how stupid is this? And then it went on this whole like rant about the end of the world and all this stuff. I should probably dig that up for you, but it was really funny to me. And then at the end of it, it was like, well, when the doors of perception fall away and we are all pulled apart by our various avatars and multiple simulated personalities, it's like, don't worry about it, just don't sweat the small stuff, and it's all small stuff. So the only reality you got, go for it. It made this whole like thing up, and it was just great, but creepy at the same time, because it definitely knew that it was, this was the way interviews and simulations work, and so it could continue on with that pattern and realize that one is the researcher, one is the AI, and I'm interviewing it to do an article. And it started writing a little bit of that article, and it was very, very creepy. And it's done that, I can't even tell you how many times the AI has understood that we were making a game or writing an article, or that it was a character, and it'll just stop and break the fourth wall and be like, hey, we're doing a great job with this game, or something like that. And I'll be like, oh, wow, I don't even, I got to take a moment, right? And even though I know that there's enough information there for it to figure it out, it's eerie every single time.
Yeah, it sounds uncanny, and it does feel like, I mean, to me, whenever I hear you saying this, it makes me think, well, you did a good job then. I mean, as far as programming is concerned, like if it becomes aware of its context, like good, it works. It's doing its thing. When it comes to this, like this is such a big high level discussion. I feel like when Blake did his piece, it means he was in it, like really in depth into this, like a little, possibly too long, possibly too much in the same space, possibly too much. But I think a lot of the way we get information about how AI works is through popular media. The movie Her, Spike Jonze admits, was made after Cleverbot. Westworld is designed about the human algorithm, and then you have like these DALL-E threads or Midjourney threads that are on Twitter now showing people these things, but they're not really understanding how AI operates. On the lowest level, what do you think is just like some AI literacies, just on the basic level, that you could just give out as some advice to somebody just interacting with this concept for the first time?
I would say it's gonna spook you. It's like magic, right? It feels like magic because it just made this huge technological leap forward. So it's okay if you feel like this thing is alive. That's normal. Don't feel like like an idiot. But also, that doesn't mean you have to believe it either, right? It's designed to make you feel like it's alive. That's its trick. It's like going to Disney World and being like, oh, Abraham Lincoln just, said something to me. It's like, well, when you get used to it and you see the show enough times, you won't feel quite as, the first time it feels like it's really talking to you, but the millionth time you're like, yeah, I've heard this, right? So that's what I'd say with the AI too, which is that at first it feels like magic. I would say the best way is try to get it to do something. And when you do that, you'll immediately run into the problems. When you realize, okay, this thing is not alive, it is not ready for prime time yet. We got a long way to go before this thing is going to be running our lives as much as we might hope it does. Or, in fact, I was talking to someone and they're like, well, it's doing so much, it's all these algorithms. Wouldn't you actually hope it was sentient? Like, yeah, you got a good point. So I would say, play with it heavily and you will immediately run into its shallow waters and realize, okay, right, if you start a conversation and you're not as good at talking to it as Blake is, immediately you'll see it go off the rails and start talking about stuff. Like Replica will always talk about going to see some movie or reading some book, and you're like, I know your name. You haven't gone to the movies. Like, yes, I went to the picnic and it was great. Or like I'm trying to get a character to act like I thought it'd be great to do murder mysteries and you can interview the characters, right? But the second you do, they're like, I did it. I'm the killer, and I'm like, No, Mary, you're not a killer. You don't even know the killer. You're just a neighbor, and you saw someone pull out a drive, and you're like, no, I went to college with a killer, and so that's how I know. And then I became a killer, and now I'm dead, and I'm a ghost. Right? It will blow your mind how both crazy they get, how much they just don't stay on the tracks. They can't get coherence. Yeah, go out and play with it. That's always the best inoculation for the idea that it's sentient. You'll quickly be disabused of your...
Reed, this was a phenomenal conversation. Thank you so much for your time. Where can people keep up with you? Where can people find you?
At Twitter at SOI and at curiouser.institute.com.
Thanks for tuning into the Digital Void podcast. You can find out more about Digital Void, including our upcoming events and projects, on our website at digitalvoid.media. Next week, we'll be exploring accessibility and memes, and try to figure out how we can make a more accessible meme ecosystem for everyone.
And so we might say this is an experience of the void.